I'm saying that because my talk today investigates the beginning of a politicized music culture reminiscent of African heritage, in the context actually of the 1960s and 70s civil rights movement and the decolonization that Luis has already mentioned. But I focus not on Africa or on the global south, but I focus on West Germany. The talk today shows how a new small music public developed in West Germany, which was dependent on alternative record labels. Black musicians tried to use these structures to anchor musical traditions in Europe from the former African colonies. Using the example of the African-American jazz group Mombasa, the talk today examines how black musicians in West Germany began to update, revitalize, in a way, African sonic heritage in order to protest against racism and marginalization. Yet, and that's a very important thing, also to be economically successful in the changing music market. So, I argue that commercial and political aims of these protagonists were closely intertwined. At the center of this talk is the band Mombasa, founded by the African-American musicians around the group's leader Lou Blackburn in West Berlin in 1973. Mombasa's musicians have been migrating from the US to West Germany in the years before '73. They released 5 records in West Germany between 1975 and 1981, and they toured in various European countries at the time. Mombasa existed actually in very changing formations. I don't want to introduce you to each musician of that formation, like individually. With their sonic and visual interventions, Mombasa not only records the East African coastal metropolis of present-day Kenya, you all know Mombasa, the sound city, like the coast city, but they also constructed an update of East African traditions. So let's listen and watch a live performance of the band from the year 1976. Mombasa's music was characterized, as you heard, by an African instrumentation, woodwinds, cowbells and percussion, among others, as well as rhythm concerts and ritual chanting from Africa, which is, you haven't heard this, but that's also part of that performance. As you see here on the slide, the band used traditional dress and visual imaginings of East African rurality for the design of their album covers. The ideas for Mombasa's audiovisual aesthetics were, according to an interview with Blackburn in the German jazz journal Swinging Newsletter, as he's quoted, a direct result of his African heritage. That's the word that he used. Although Blackburn also emphasized the importance of West Indian and American influences for his music, the album covers, and the band's visual appearance in general. Mombasa's return to the African roots was a highly political and spiritually charged endeavor. It aimed at displaying the value of forms of culture and design which had long been marginalized by Western cultural dominance. The label heritage was and is a term used by politically, culturally and socially marginalized actors to give a public voice and political power to older music styles that are forgotten or little recognized in certain places. The band around Blackburn, they can be seen as a part of an Afrocentric musical cultural memory, a memory culture, or the German term Erinnerungskultur, that developed in times of global protest and against colonialism. Since the 1960s, black musicians from the US, the Caribbean and other parts of the global south, they have increasingly referenced civil rights movement of the 1960s, 1970s, think of Martin Luther King's work in the US, that's all of you know that, but also the political independence of African states from European colonial empires in the 1950s and 1970s. All this provide the context, the political context, what we have seen. In these years, as researchers have shown in many examples, the intensified recourse to this long marginalized musical heritage became a statement for political rights and cultural empowerment of black people. And that's where I come in with this talk today. Way less attention has been paid to the fact that the adoption of musical heritage for protest took place in a changing commercial music market, which provided important infrastructures and financial incentives for the dissemination of Afrocentric music.
Focusing on the US, the music historian Ofer Ghazi, he speaks of a spiritual commodification of African jazz in the 1960s and 70s. Ofer's approach shifts the focus to the commercialization and the sale of African jazz, not to say its inscription into capitalist structures. Afrocentric jazz, actually, that's the hypothesis of him, becomes a commodity. Yet Ghazi's works sees African American jazz musicians primarily as exploited by the music industry without considering their agency within the emerging public market for that music. This was by no means like, I use the term agency here as a capacity of the oppressed to act and resist within structures of oppression. Ghazi's approach misses the fact that black musicians actively commercialized African heritage within and beyond the dominating white music industry. This was by no means limited to music, actually. On this slide, as you see here, you see a poster advertising of traditional African clothes known as dashikis, which were sold in specialized shops in the US during the 1960s and 70s. In this period, it was also not uncommon for African American television entertainers, for instance, to wear African clothing. So without denying that spiritual commodification had an exploitive dimension, that it was based on the power of the Western recording industry, white music producers and white consumerism, my talk today aims to find out more about the economic agency of African American musicians. I do this by following the band Mombasa through 1970s Germany. Throughout the 1970s, the Mombasa musicians, they repeatedly attempted to engage in marketing during the band's performances on stage, in music journals and on television programs, by claiming certain terminologies for their music. These terminologies included terms like New African Jazz or African Jazz from Berlin, as Lou Blackman put it in West German TV in the WDR-Sendung in like 1976. These were like kind of used to reserve the band or the music group a kind of distinctive place within a changing West German music public. Blackburn sometimes referred to Mombasa's work simply as Mombasa music because the term jazz alone seemed rather inappropriate to him. He did this because the term jazz did not have a strong promotional effect in the 1970s, at least outside the rather small circle of jazz fans. Yet, Blackburn's aversion against the term reflected also the discriminatory ways white Americans had long used jazz for to devalue African American music as a form of art. Mombasa's terminological marketing intended to generate public attention for the band in what was perceived a very promising market, a public market, a new public market. West Germany was, globally seen, one of the biggest music markets in the 1970s, not only due to the success of cheesy German folk music, you know, most of you know that as the 1970s Schlager, you know, it's still like somehow visible, but also because of the expanding rock sector, as well as related fusion genres such as jazz rock. The 1970s were extremely lucrative for commercial music projects due to their increased sales numbers. Music, also generally, the time spent listening to records skyrocketed. It was getting really big, especially among younger age groups. Music by white German rock musicians, however, that played a minor role in Germany, just about 1% of the sales in the 1970s. That's a fact that I think must have played out as an additional incentive and a push factor for Blackburn's band to settle in Germany and to do what they did. In an interview with the, we're kind of a bit lost. Sorry. In an interview with the German Jazz Podium in 1975, Blackburn emphasized also the novelty of Mombasa's music for Europe. Well, in fact, however, Mombasa only helped to develop a public for Afrocentric jazz. Comparable ventures existed already, but without major commercial success. At the 1967 Berlin Jazz Days, for example, the Nigerian drummer Babatunde Olatunji represented Afro jazz styles in the Jazz Meets Africa section of the program. In 1970, Billy Brooks' album El Babaku was released in the record series Jazz Meets the World of the German South MPS record label. In the US, on the other hand, there were significantly more Afrocentric music initiatives, not least because labels such as Roulette, Blue Note, Prestige or Columbia offered way better opportunity. Yet records by Art Blakey, Dizzy Gillespie or Jack Constance were imported from the US and the UK to West Germany. They confronted West German listening habits with African musical heritage, already before Mombasa was found in 1973. Yeah. On both sides of the Atlantic, music markets were characterized by protests against racism and colonialism, including visions emphasizing cosmopolitan dialogue. During their concerts and interviews in West Germany, in magazines, in radio and TV programs as we've seen, Mombasa's musicians staged their Afro jazz as an inclusive listening event that transcended supposed cultural boundaries. Blackburn never got tired of emphasizing the compatibility of the band's music with diverse consumer groups. My intention, as he put it, is to make African music known in Europe. However, Blackburn also admitted that the lack of guitar and keyboard instruments, which were increasingly becoming famous and anchored in musical scene in Europe in the 1960s and 70s, that this lack had created problems in understanding Mombasa's music in Europe, at least, especially at the early stage. Nonetheless, the band's tours, the festival performances, radio and television presences, as Blackburn also saw it, had weakened these obstacles and made listeners more and more used to that sound. So we should understand these comments of Blackburn and the band as kind of integrative ideas of how to locate and spread Mombasa's music in Europe. There we go. These ideas were composed, and that's very important now, against the backdrop of a West German society in which racist perception of black musicians was strongly anchored. A journalist from the German language journal Jazz Forum, for example, he reminded the Mombasa stage formation at live performances, and I quote him, of an African village and tribal hierarchy. The comment demonstrates that thought patterns of late 19th and early 20th century colonial era far outlived the formal collapse and breakdown of European empires. When the commentator referred to Blackburn, another quote, as a chief or medicine man, he projected stereotypes about a typical African political organization onto the band itself. These stereotypes implied that the band Mombasa was organized, well, in a typical African way, in a completely undemocratic manner. So that's the stereotype, right? This mirrored, however, and that's also important, a general discriminatory treatment of black musicians in West German media, one could say. Good example is the West German television program Black is Beautiful, that's how it was called, which was produced by the Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen, ZDF, in 1972. And there we have white moderators discriminating artists such as James Brown, Tina Turner, Miriam Makeba, using really discriminatory vocabulary. And reports on this program, for instance in German news and news journals such as Der Spiegel, they were rather comparably racist. Well, the band Mombasa, I was pretty surprised, they really took a surprisingly mild view of public racism in West Germany. I found archives comments which are really surprising for me. In a West German TV show in 1976, Lou Blackburn stated that he had left the US primarily because of the racism there. In comparison, he said he feels, I quote him, very comfortable in Germany. The significance of this passage I find it difficult to assess, as Blackburn was speaking on West German television and he might have felt under pressure not to be too critical of West German conditions. Yet, we should not completely discount his choice of words. They are less surprising if we consider critical objections to racist marginalization of black musicians in German public. For example, TV viewers also, not just, but also reacted with criticism to the Black is Beautiful program in the ZDF. And they highlighted also discrimination. In addition, Mombasa were also strongly entangled with rather cosmopolitan milieu, cosmopolitan milieu of the German jazz scene and the krautrock groups. That's the German version of progressive rock and electronic music that developed since the 1960s. Many of these protagonists, they were rather left-wing, anti-imperialist views were widely spread among them, and many were downright fascinated by African-American musicians and activists. I think that these groups must have given Mombasa the feeling that they at least were better in West Germany than in the US. West Germany's alternative scene, with krautrock as one of its central pillars, they have been developing since the 60s, as I said. White German musicians here played a very, very important role. They also made up a central portion of the visitors to Mombasa's live performances. Contemporary observers saw an audience at that performances that, I quote, clapped enthusiastically and sang along to the given lyrics. Blackburn stated in the German Jazz Podium in '75 that, another quote, audiences at our concerts react physically to the rhythm, even if they are hardly able to follow it in its diversity and if they cannot grasp its polyrhythm intellectuality. The reactions of the band's German producer, the Cologne-based Manfred Schmitz, to encounter with Blackburn in '75 represent the spiritual emotion alternative Germans were struck by when they experienced their band. I quote Schmitz, "When he," meaning Blackburn, "gave me his hand to greet me, I felt an unknown calm and a sovereignty from this great man. His eyes looked at me kindly through metal-rimmed glasses. They looked so warm, and I felt that he was looking at me with his heart." Mombasa's public appearance and the theatrical staging serve, that's obvious from that, West German needs for more spirituality. Contemporaries also noticed the, I quote, exotic flair of the band. So what was meant as a compliment was the product of an emotionalized, quasi-religious perception of African music heritage, which was gaining more and more ground in the circle of white West Germans in the 1970s. It was further beneficial for the admiration of West German alternatives that Blackburn avoided to portray the band Mombasa as a commercial project, at least in public. I quote them again. "Various record companies have accused us of being too commercial, whereas others have criticized the exact opposite, that our music is not commercial enough, so therefore difficult to sell. Blackburn, I'm not interested in such questions because I can't prostitute myself in that way. I already earned enough money in the US, was able to afford what I wanted and to fulfill all my material desires. So, musical art, spirituality, commercial success, and heritage in that kind of idea were not compatible in that narrative. This anti-capitalist rhetoric appealed to white German consumers, and they encouraged them to support the band through record purchases and concert attendances. However, a commercial dimension of the band Mombasa can hardly be overlooked. The band's albums were all released on smaller or medium-sized independent records labels from the krautrock or the alternative sector. Blackburn knew the krautrock scene through his involvement as a tromboist with the Berlin krautrock band Agitation Free shortly before Mombasa was founded. Mombasa's first two records, African Rhythm and Blues and Mombasa 2 from '76, they were both released on the Stuttgart label Spiegelei, fried egg in English, like the German term for fried egg. Spiegelei was part of the German progressive rock labels that emerged since the late 1960s to supply the national and also the international market. Trade infrastructures of these labels operated independent from those of the big major record companies. Spiegelei had around 5,000 to 10,000 copies, quite a lot at that time, copies made from Mombasa's first two records. With these numbers, Mombasa was more or less on par with the larger acts in the German krautrock scene. Maybe some of you know Tangerine Dream, Ashra Temple or Guru Guru, who sold around 50,000, a bit more, on other labels such as Ohr or Pilz, which are kind of very similar to Spiegelei. Average crowd releases, like that stuff that was not that important, were around 300 to 1,000. However, Spiegelei did not advertise Mombasa's albums as major labels did that for their artists, but only acted as a distributor of the records to record stores. Mombasa's albums, they were available at alternative record stores in Germany, in West Germany, but also at the centers of German record consumption of the 70s and 80s, such as the vinyl record department of Cologne's store Saturn at Hansering. That was the mecca for vinyl in that time. Additionally, crazy, right? Additionally, it's not anymore. Additionally, the band Mombasa was also involved in the retail of the records by selling them themselves at the band's live performances. Even though this emergent alternative music label culture in West Germany represented the central infrastructure for making Afrocentric music public and popular, musicians such as Mombasa also, that's important, tried to raise the interest of bigger record companies. In '75, Blackburn introduced himself to Rudi Petri in Cologne, the head of Edition Accord, a sub-label of the Electric Musical Industries Company, better known for a lot of you, for most of you probably as EMI. The conversation between Blackburn and Petri has not come down to us. We don't have that. Anyway, it's lost. However, we can conclude from that visit that Blackburn was considering to use the distribution, marketing, and financial support of a major record label to enlarge also the public outreach of Mombasa's heritage performance. MI was synonymous with commercial success in that time. The company had 32 subsidiaries or departments in 29 countries. In the 70s, MI, together with Columbia, Polygram, Warner, Radio Corporation America, called RCA, they became the big 5 major record labels that basically controlled music markets worldwide to a very high degree. Major labels like MI, they seemed relevant to musicians like Blackburn because these majors began to search for acts influenced by music from the global south in the 1970s. In '78, for instance, Columbia opened a 2-site scouting facility in Kenya, also modeled on the strategy of Island Records, which had made Jamaican reggae musician Bob Marley an international star. That's the same logic going on there. Labels also began to release traditional African music heritage on record series in the 60s and 70s. MI pursued this to the so-called Musical Atlas series that you can find one example of here on this slide. Cologne-based MI, however, did not enter into a deal with Mombasa. No. Why was that so? As Ofagazi had shown, I think what he said, you can, to the US, you can take also for Germany, major record companies, they were largely cautious about how they spent their resources in regard of the support of Afrocentric jazz. Afro-jazz projects were relatively expensive to produce. They were arranged for larger ensembles, often with brass, extended brass section, and also percussion. You had to pay a lot of people, so that was a problem. Given the comparatively small sales market of these records, major labels were not sure whether they would make enough profits from these releases. Furthermore, the political views on equality, decolonization, civil rights, etc., they were difficult to promote within the US and Europe. So, not everyone, especially not the masses, were open to that political messages of black musicians. Therefore, African-themed projects were risky ventures for that companies that did not appeal to the masses, right? Some jazz albums with African themes, such as Cannonball Adderley's African Waltz, for instance, you know, they were rather successful in the US and released on larger labels, but they were basically exceptions and nothing really that we have to focus on. Therefore, the ignorance of Cologne-based MI towards Mombasa, you know, it was business as usual. The lack of interest also made Mombasa a rather medium-sized music act. All right, let me just briefly conclude. If you follow the band Mombasa in the 1970s, you see attempts to anchor African sonic heritage in Europe. The band members around Lou Blackburn were politically committed micro-entrepreneurs in times of global decolonization and the rediscovery of African cultural heritage. Mombasa is a case of post-colonial memory because the band's music is a cultural re-accentuation, we come back to that, of heritage, a project to relocate cultural memory that had been colonial marginalized by the West. The West German music market offered the band, as you heard, a really special publicity for this because here Afrocentric jazz, it was in its infancy. It was basically very small. So, but it also meant it was a gap that they wanted to fill. Anyway, there was demand for more. That's also important. The alternative music circles that had emerged in that time, they helped Mombasa to combine political protest against oppression with interest in commercial success and economic prosperity. Nevertheless, the anchoring of this post-colonial memory was always limited. On the one hand, due to the racist-motivated rejections that black musicians faced from the white mainstream media landscape, but also by the lack of willingness on the part of the larger record companies to take risks. On a more general level, and that's my last thing that I say, my contribution, I hope that it showed today that we should consider these activist attempts, musical activist attempts, to anchor this memory in their respective time. You know, we should really be focused on different time zones and the context, but, and that's also important, not at the same time, not lose sight of the specific conditions that the music public, for example, place these attempts in front of. So, thank you very much for your attendance and for the attention,